Hello and welcome to Film 253 Narrative for the Digital Age. Today we are going to talk about how movies defy linearity and reject causal logic with regards to the successions of the sequences. In previous weeks, we talked about three acts structure and how the narrative structure of classical films, the line of actions. David Bordwell would argue that the narrative structure of classical cinema is very consistent and follows cause and effect logic. In Hollywood movies, a happy ending is usually used as a form of resolution to the plot, although it's not structurally necessary. A linear narrative with a specific goal assigned to the central character may end with the failure of that character to achieve that goal. Defying such narrative logic is not something new. It happened in films like Je t'aime or La Jetée. However, there is a tendency in contemporary mainstream Hollywood films, for example, the films of Christopher Nolan, to break away with narrative patterns and confuse the viewers and create some sort of a storytelling gimmick or a puzzle for the viewer to solve. For example, Memento by Christopher Nolan has a very non-linear narrative structure. Similarly, many other films in the late 90s were using that sort of non-linear structure. For example, Autumn Egoyan's Exotica or In the Mood for Love by Wong Kar-wai. Or if you have seen Pulp Fiction by Tarantino, each of them might be different. Like in Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, there is a linear logic. It is just reordered, reconfigured in different ways. In Run Lola Run, fork narrative has been used, or like different plot lines, like with different endings at the same time going on in the movie. However, in Memento, it's different because this nonlinearity is motivated by the central character's confusion and the loss of memory. So in Memento, the audience, like a detective, is trying to find a clue to recreate the right version of the story. So the story is non-chronological, and the audiences keep finding new pieces of the puzzle. There are black and white scenes that are not necessarily motivated with the character's mental impulses, and in those scenes, the audiences would get more clues than the central character. Like Run Lola Run, we see the repetitions of events in Memento, and in a way, each time through these repeated events, we realize something different. Such movies require attention. It's not like if you miss 3 minutes of it to go to the bathroom, you can fill the gap yourself with the logic of the plot. If you miss a bit of this movie, you're going to miss the entire films. And in a way, it happened each time you watch the movie. Um, when you watch Memento over and over again, each time you realize the true storyline in a better way. You understand that there are more clues given in this puzzle film.
Best way to draw it is as a hairpin, like that. That's basically the end of the movie. This stuff is the black and white stuff. This is color. And this is running backwards as a series of jumps. And what we do is we cut between the two the whole way through. So we alternate scene here, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, and they meet towards the end of the film. But then within this, you have flashbacks to a different timeline, which is actually even earlier, somewhere around there. Also within this, you have flashbacks to an earlier time, also somewhere within there. So I guess you could use the hairpin shape to represent the bulk of the film. with the black and white, with the color, meeting in the last reel, the end of the film being sort of there-ish after it turns into color and kind of leads us into the beginning of that preceding scene. But you have other material that actually precedes the beginning of the black and white scenes. And the gap between the beginning of the black and white scenes and this long-term memory stuff, some of which is color, some of which is black and white, that gap is unspecified. The lead character, because of his particular condition, he can never know how long that's been. He's cut loose in time, effectively. So we never wanted to specify for the audience. We imply a length of time to it, because it's the time in which he's had these tattoos put on, he's been living this life, and so forth. So that gap, to me, is where the most interesting ambiguity of the film is.
However, comparing this film with the movie that's been assigned for this week by David Lynch, you can see that there is still a bit different. In Christopher Nolan's Memento, still there is a real conventional revenge plot in behind. What makes this movie very interesting is the complex narrative structure of the film. Otherwise, the story is very simple. The reverse narrative of the plot, the fact that the movie's conclusion is revealed in its first 5 minutes. The temporal logic of the film can be reconfigured usually by flashbacks. So, as I said, in classical Hollywood films, the movies are linear, but sometimes there are flashbacks that are there to explain the current situation. So, at the same time that there is manipulations of temporal logic of the film, it is there to add linearity. However, as I said earlier, the narrative films in the last 25 years moved away from such logical linearity. So in contemporary films, you can see that flashbacks are not bracketed. Like sometimes they're black and white in classical films, or sometimes we always know it's a flashback. We always know it's a distance. It doesn't have an imminent effect on the film narrative. However, in contemporary films, they can show different layers, different time layers or temporal layers without giving a sense of priority or certainty to each. Film critic D.N. Rodovit, movies such as Michael Haneke's Cache, Hidden, they deal with this conceptualization of memory and history as the past re-emerges, raises the question of power relation among individuals and the viewers as an individual observers. So the past is not passive. It's observing us, it's controlling us. It cannot be repressed. It's not like voluntarily recollection, like when we want it to explain, we remember it, and other times we can get rid of it. The past always coexists with the present time. So there's another film critic, Ricardo Demizio, who reads this film Cache through a Deleuzian lens by saying that the digital cinema of Michael Haneke is manifestly schizophrenic. And again, schizophrenia is another term used by Deleuze. He doesn't use that because it's a clinical term in his cinema book, but actually in his philosophy, it is something that is in a state of being that he actually promotes. And so this schizophrenia of digital image, he says, is the intrinsic byproduct of this decoding process. The film constantly tricks its viewer, and first there is the long take establishing shot that proves to be merely a recorded image that can be replayed. So in that sense, Haneke shows up the possibility of manipulating different layers of expectations in his movie. So let's talk about the idea of narrative incongruity in the films of David Lynch. So far, we talked about the idea of fork narrative, like Run, Lola, Run, with the idea of flash forwards or flashbacks, with the repetitions of different possibilities, but each one is distinguishable from the other. We also talked about misplaced order of narrative segments like Pulp Fiction. On the other hand, we talked about Memento when this narrative incongruity is motivated by the character's psychology or condition, the fact that he has an amnesia. So it's a very subjective, very psychological approach to narrative fragmentation. What is interesting about David Lynch's films is that these two are indistinguishable. So there is the blurring of the objective and subjective narrative modes. We cannot say that this unchronological approach to narrative structure is caused by reconfiguration of the plot or psychological conditions of the central characters. Sometimes the characters do suffer from amnesia or schizophrenia and they have certain hallucinatory dreams or recollections of the past, but it seems that the narrative and the plot line are not dependent to that subjective experience of the past or the events of the story. There are supposedly rational detective figures in some of his films, like Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive, but they are also as unreliable as the characters. We never understand that hallucinatory scenes presented in the films are coming from the mind of the central characters that we should identify with, or they are just alternative realities like fork narrative, fork patterns offered by the structure of the narrative. His films are carefully scripted, and there's always an interesting mystery that, like a detective, the audience is trying to resolve. But at the end, it is never determinable. Like the movie doesn't make sense. So, this uncertainty between the so-called objective and the subjective narrative layers is at the center of David Lynch's films. So, when there is a flashback, we never know if that's a real. So, the recollection coming from the memory of the character, we never know that it's actually a memory or desire. Is it a past or a subjective past? Is it really explaining the situation in the present? Does it really happen? Or it's just the way the character wanted to happen? Although, again, what is interesting is that we are not really in the mind of the characters. His films are not psychologically driven. At the end, even the identity of each character is not recognized by the spectator, that is like a mystery film is taking the role of the detective. So, in terms of generic syntax of the film, it has a bit of detective stories in his films, but one that has always been mixed with fantasy. In his film Twin Peaks, even the identities of the characters are not fixed. Then how can we solve the mystery at the center of the narrative? In other words, the film's diegesis is never resolved and is always altered, unlike classical film. So, in short, unlike films like Run Lola Run, where these fork paths are all clearly defined, or films like Pulp Fiction with displaced narrative structure, the films of David Lynch is blurring the distinction between these alternative modes. It is also the blurring of the line between desire and fantasy that is happening in his films. Usually in mainstream films, these two things do exist, but they are distinguishable. And because of that, we can configure the diegesis of the film pretty well. However, in the films of David Lynch, the social reality of the film is ambiguously mixed with fantasy. Both the objective and subjective attempts in reading his films would fail. The way the story is unfolded for us is not based on characters' imagination, or the line of actions in the film's diegesis. So, in a way, narrative in David Lynch's film is not used to explain anything in the diegesis, is not used to reveal anything. Narrative is actually working independently. And for that reason, it's frustrating to watch his movie. In other words, the narrative doesn't care about what in the film's diegesis is an illusion or a reality. The goal of the narration is to create a sense of mistrust in the viewers about everything in the diegesis.